into a discussion about the policy context that futures work like scenario creation must feed. And then I'll finish the discussion with a brief overview of the focal question. All scenario creation work starts out with a focal question, and getting this question right is imperative to having a successful exercise. So, in the context of scenario creation, as I'm talking about this morning, a scenario is a story of the future. And these stories are fictional stories. They're created primarily through imagination and cognition. They're, of course, supported by logic and, where possible, by science. But the key takeaway is that you are creating a fictional story set in the future about a future state. The stories are generally generated in a set, usually a set of 4. Occasionally people will generate more, but 4 is a common number. And collectively, these stories paint a picture about a range of plausible future states. And the other key thing about the scenario stories is from where you are today, you must be able to see the logic of how the forces and factors could unfold and get you to that point in the future. So the stories have to be plausible. They have to be challenging, and they do not defy any laws of nature. So water doesn't run uphill in these stories. They need to be sensible, but creative. You'll also hear me talk about generatively complex issues. You use this term. Now, this is a term that was coined by a world-renowned futurist by the name of Adam Kahane. And he wrote a book called Solving Tough Problems, where he talks about these kinds of issues and how some of the approaches, you might find it an interesting read if you care to take a look at it. But the characteristics of generatively complex issues are that these are large cross-cutting issues. They're characterized by the fact that the chains of cause and effect are apart in space and time. So what happens today has some effect, some time in the future, undefined, and maybe in a different geographic location as well. They tend to be unfolding in unfamiliar and unpredictable ways, so we don't have a lot of historical precedents. So things like trends, which are things that are happening, and we measure what's happening projected forward, trend tracking, things like that, are not that useful when we're dealing with these kinds of new emergent problems. And finally, in some ways, I think maybe this is the most important complexity of these issues, is that the people involved see things very differently, and so the problem often becomes polarized. A classic example of a generatively complex issue is climate change. For some people, climate change is a good thing. For others, people think it's a disaster. We don't have a lot of historical experience with changing climate, and the impacts, the environmental impacts that are underway today are going to cause effects long into the future, and we're not really sure about the degree or pace or complexity or how these will manifest themselves. The other term that I often hear people talk about when they're talking about futures thinking and future studies. They use the word forecasting. And in this context that I'm in this morning, forecasting is defined as a prediction of the future. It's based on known relationships and assumptions, and it typically involves quantitative analysis. It uses data from the past and the present to project forward into the future. And, you know, this is challenging because we have no data about the future, so we can only, if this is a data-based endeavor, the data can only come from the past and the present. And we often see, or maybe are involved with exercises, trend analysis, trend tracking, environmental scanning exercises, economic projections, and even a fair amount of computer modeling is forecasting work. Because of its quantitative base, you have to have empirical numbers and make some assumptions around those. Because of the nature of this, where you're starting from the past to the present and projecting forward, forecasting is useful for the near term. And near term is a bit subjective, but typically I say it's no more than 5 years. This can be a bit determined by subject matter, but it's really the point where the data that you're using to do your quantitative analysis becomes unreliable. In the 21st century, I think sometimes this has a shelf life of days, not years. And we use forecasting for risk management. And I'm just going to deviate a little bit here to talk about risk and risk management. We manage risk because we can define a set of known variables that have potential risk-causing characteristics, and we study those variables. We gather quantitative data around them. Take, for instance, a tornado. We know a lot about tornadoes. We know the weather characteristics that cause them. We've categorized them into different wind speeds. We know what parts of the country get hit. We know certain times of the year that they're more prevalent than others. And as a result of all of that data that we've been able to analyze, we put into place risk management strategies such as better engineered buildings, public education programs, insurance packages that are designed to mitigate the risk from tornadoes. We don't know when the exact date this tornado might occur, but we do know that we have in place strategies that should we be hit by a tornado, many of the worst case damages can be mitigated. And I'd like to say at this point that scenario creation is not used to make forecasts. Scenario creation is a foresight tool. And I'm going to differentiate foresight from forecasting because it's an important differentiation to make. Foresight is about the systematic exploration of the long-term future. And you do this work with the view of informing current decisions. This is particularly true when the long-term future holds high degrees of uncertainty. Because there is no data about the future, this is mainly a qualitative exercise, and it involves using imagination and cognition. Of course, we support that by science where possible, but in the absence of sound data, the imagination, what we know, and what we can imagine will happen are really the best tools we have to understand the long-term future. Typically, we're working in time frames of 20 years or more in the future. And the difference between this kind of work and forecasting work is that forecasting starts from the present and the past and projects forward. Foresight work goes out into the future horizons, examines what's there, and then works backwards to today. And some of you are probably familiar with expert panels, Delphi surveys. You know what gaming is, and scenario creation. These are a few of the tools that are available to do foresight work. Now, one of the things I'd like to point out is that each of these tools has its own strengths and weaknesses, and it's important to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each so that you can apply it right to the right kinds of issues and the right kinds of time frames. Let me give you an example of expert panels. Probably most of you are quite familiar with expert panels. This is, you assemble a group of experts, so right away there's some challenge on who's an expert, and then, what's the shelf life of expertise, but we take the best we can get right now. We give people, this group of people, a question to work away at an answer that has maybe a 20-year time frame. And they go away and they analyze and assess this question, and they come back with a report. In order to generate that report, they've had to work together to form consensus. And so what you end up doing is you end up getting a consensus view of basically a single future. Get premature movement to consensus, and often in these kinds of situations, those people that may have really interesting, challenging, outlying ideas, they never show up in the report. So Delphi surveys similar gaming, the simplification of the user-computer interface is making gaming more powerful tool to explore the future. And of course, scenario creation, which is the one that I'm going to spend my time on this morning. Scenario creation is used to manage future uncertainty. Foresight, as a field, recognizes that uncertainty exists in the future and that it's not really possible to reduce future uncertainty. All you can do is to try to study it and grapple with it. The usefulness of this tool is when you have these kind of complex, emergent, generatively complex issues described by Adam Kahane. This is the most powerful tool for that kind of approach. So I'm going to move on here to telling you a little bit about the process of scenario development. The scenario creation methodology that I'm about to outline here is sometimes called intuitive logic scenario creation, and it's not a new tool. The first iterations of this approach were developed after World War II by a man named Herman Kahn, who worked for the RAND Corporation. And he developed the stories about the future of nuclear war. And his feeling was that if people could imagine what it would be like to experience nuclear war, then they'd make different decisions and try to avoid that phenomenon in the future. And Kahn actually came under a lot of criticism. The term thinking the unthinkable emerged from his work. He left the RAND Corporation, went out into the academic world, and some of the people who encountered him there then went on to work for Royal Dutch Shell and brought this thinking process, the scenario creation process, into Royal Dutch Shell in the mid-60s and refined it into the process that I'm going to present today. Well, that Shell has used this process ever since then as a key part of their strategic decision-making process. And they're not alone. Several large corporations around the world use this approach on a regular basis. Shell is perhaps some of the most published work. A lot of the work that's done in the private sector is quite confidential and you wouldn't find it published, but other companies that I can cite that use scenario creation on a regular basis as part of their strategic decision-making process are companies like Siemens, Philips, General Electric. Just yesterday I was reading something on a listserv that I received that was saying that the Australian Police Department is going to use this process to look at the future of policing. And more recently, governments have began to use this process. When I say more recently, it's all relative. The UK government has been using foresight work and scenario creation in one form or the other off and on for probably 20 years. Same could be said for the French government. Even the Canadian government has pockets of people who are working on this kind of process. But it's a much newer introduction into the public sector than the private sector. And the public sector presents its own sets of challenges for using this work, of which I will discuss a bit as I move on in my presentation. So let me just show you the process of scenario development. So the first step in any scenario creation process is to define a focal question or an issue and to choose a relevant time frame in the future that you want to look at this issue. And typically it's 20 years or more. This is topic dependent. We recently did some work looking at the futures of circumpolar north, and we went 40 to 50 years in the future. I would suggest, given the rotation of the forest being 80 to 100 years, that 20 years may or may not be too short. Depends particularly what you're discussing. But you have to kind of tailor that time frame to the topic, but this is not a medium or short-term tool. This is a long-term tool. Depending upon the makeup of the group of participants, and as I say in the bottom there, typically scenario development exercise involves 25 to 50 people. If you have a group of people that have a very strong knowledge of the issue, you may not have to spend a lot of time reviewing past events and interpreting how you got to where you are today. But if you have a very eclectic group of people who are quite positional on a topic, you may have to spend some time getting some kind of common view of where we are today and how we got there. That's the preparatory work. And then you get into the main body of the work of a scenario creation exercise. And the first step is the identification of the driving forces and factors. These are large uncertainties that they're forces and factors that will shape the issue. Some of them you will know, they're already in existence today. Some you can speculate on that are going to come into existence, and some you just simply may not have included them in the list as you've thought about this issue in the past. Typically this is a few hours of work with a group of 25 to 50 people, and you would end up with a list 20, 25, no set number, but just in approximation, driving forces and factors that you think are going to be critical to this issue or question going forward in the future. The next step then, in order to start a conversation about this, is to choose the two from that list of forces and factors that you think have the greatest uncertainty about how they're going to turn out in the future, but also the greatest impact. So they go like X, the world's going to be one way, but if they go like Y, it's going to be completely different. Take, for instance, if climate change is often one of those driving forces and factors, and the big uncertainty around climate change is the degree and pace of it. I mean, if it's very rapid and quite severe, I mean, the ability to cope, adapt, manage, survive it is one thing. If it progresses in a slower manner or management ability increases, then the world will be a quite different place. So you plot these top two critical uncertainties, as we label them, on a horizontal and a vertical axis, and they become the framework for the development of 4 stories about the future. These are distinct stories, so each story is a story in itself, but they're linked by the interaction of the 2 critical uncertainties. And the rest of the list, if you had 20 driving forces and factors, you selected 2 to put on the axes, there's 18 others there. Each story is developed by saying, okay, you know, if the world is like this and this, then how would all these others feed into it? So nothing is lost in this process. And if this sounds a little confusing at this point, I apologize, but I think my next couple of slides will provide some clarity to you. But the key point is identify the forces and factors, choose the 2 top critical uncertainties. They become the framework for the development of the stories. And then the next step in this process, which is usually done under at least 1, if not 2, separate engagements at a later date, is to look at each of these stories, to interpret the relevance of the story to the organization, a focal question or issue, and then describe, well, okay, if I really believe that that's the future that I'm going to be moving into, what should I be doing today? What are the implications of that? What strategies should I be putting into place? So I'm going to just walk you through an example. This was from some work that was done back in 2006. I led a collaborative scenario creation exercise here in Alberta between the Departments of Alberta Environment and the Department of Sustainable Resource Development, which is our Ministry of Forests. And we took a look at what's going to be the future management and use of Alberta's public forests. So we had, I think, about 35 people from the public and private sectors come together for a 3-day workshop, and they produced a list of driving forces and factors. And out of those 2, they selected as the 2 critical uncertainties the economic competitiveness of the forest industry. And we plotted that on the vertical axis. So that was whether the forest industry was going to be a low-growth, uncompetitive industry that continued to crank out traditional products and sell them for poor prices, or whether the industry was going to be strong and innovative, making new products, potentially involve new players. The second critical uncertainty was what is going to be the biophysical capacity of the landscape? Is it going to be lost, or is it going to be maintained? And by lost, they were talking about the impacts of climate change, of other industrial activities on the landscape, insect and disease, water shortages. And there was a discussion at this point whether that should be called climate change, but the feeling was that if you just narrowed it down to climate change, you would lose the impact of the industrial activity that from the oil and gas industry that really does impact Alberta's public forest land. On the other hand, if the biophysical capacity of the landscape can be maintained, and by that, they said it would be able to meet the biological, social, and economic demands of the day, that this would be a completely different world. These 2 critical uncertainties became the framework to create story about the future. So we're in a world where you've got a strong industry that's innovative, wanting new products, high demand for those products, but you're losing biophysical capacity. The story was in the upper left, and we always name the stories because it just makes it easier to discuss. So this one was Surge to Adapt. On the other hand, in a world 20 years from now where we have maintained our biophysical capacity, but for whatever reasons that our industry has not responded and it's low growth and uncompetitive, this was a different world, a different story. We had Adapt or Perish, which was a very harsh story where nothing was going well, biophysical capacity was down, as was the competitiveness of the industry. Or a more optimistic story where you had a strong industry and good biophysical capacity on the landscape. So here we are today in Alberta, and these four stories described a range of plausible future states that the management of public forests and the use of public forests would be operating within in the future, and they were quite distinct. New sustainable business models described climate to profit. We had changing societal values in one story. We had Surge to Adapt, and this was an interesting one. If you think about the time frame of this, the mountain pine beetle had not really crossed the rocks and come into Alberta in 2006, but it was anticipated. And so many people thought that there would be this big surge cut, all this free wood, and they were kind of looking forward to the mountain pine beetle. But one part of that discussion was, what happens if we have all of this beetle-killed wood? We have to have these surge cuts to get it, but the U.S. Economy goes into the tank and nobody really wants the wood. And that one, in hindsight, has turned out to be quite realistic for Alberta. And then we had this very bleak scenario where if industry didn't adapt to these changing conditions, that we probably wouldn't have much of an industry. So these were new pictures of the future that the forest managers who participated in this had not envisioned in their entirety in the past. But one of the things that became clear at the end of this exercise, that I think was a real kind of aha moment for all the people who participated in it, that it didn't really matter whether the future scenario was a promising one, climate to profit, or it was a very poor one, Adapt to Perish, or either of the other two in the middle, that the current business models used by the forest industry were not successful in any of these scenarios. And that was a pretty clear message that to the people in the forest sector that they were going to have to change how they're doing business, how they're thinking about management, who their customers are going to be. That was quite a powerful lesson. So hopefully that provides you with a little more clarity. So I'm going to move on from the actual methodology here and talk a little bit more about the substance of scenario creation rather than just the methodology. The point I want to make here is that scenario creation is a form of interdisciplinary research. It's not just a game or a facilitation method. It is a form of interdisciplinary research. And I think when people start to think of it that way, it gives it quite a bit more weight and credibility. It's a very powerful approach, and for informing decisions that need to be made today, and it does this by generating new insights and understandings about how the future could play out. So if we knew the future, it would be a lot easier for us to decide what to do today in response to the future. Well, this isn't, this process doesn't predict the future, but it certainly explores it and provides information about it that people have not thought about in the past. The other thing that it's very, very useful for is in challenging embedded assumptions about the future. And when I talk about embedded assumptions, that all of us have a preconceived notion about what the future is going to turn out like. And organizations have preconceived notions about what the future is going to be like. And you've probably sometimes seen a list of quotes, of famous quotes from the past where, the president of IBM said, "Why would anybody, want a personal computer?" The world is full of these, and we all do this every day. So the point of this exercise is to challenge those. Am I so sure about my assumptions about the future? The process itself is an experiential and collaborative learning process, and the result of that collaboration is that you build a common language and vision that's a very powerful platform for people to move forward from. And when you've gone through one of these scenario creation exercises and you start to talk about the stories, thinking back to the forest management one, Surge to Adapt. The people that were involved with that, if you say that story name, it brings together a whole package of conversation and makes it very easy for them to have a conversation, even though that's a fairly complex story. And, it harnesses human imagination and cognition, which are the best tools we have to study the long-term future. Any other tools that we have to study the long-term future are built on existing data from the past, embedded assumptions, whatever. And this particular process is extremely good at harnessing the collective knowledge of a group of people in a room and firing up their imagination so that they can think about the future in a different way. So if you do a scenario creation exercise, you have to know what to expect from it. And it is in itself not the end. More work is required after the scenario creation exercise to translate the insights and understandings that you generate into policy-ready recommendations. But I'll get into that in a minute. So the output from a scenario creation exercise is the learnings. It's those new insights about the future in conditions of high uncertainty. A lot of these generatively complex issues are just so overwhelming that it's difficult to even know where to start having a conversation. And it's the framework created by the axis, it just becomes a logical starting point. People have worked together. They've got to the point where they've chosen those two critical uncertainties, and they agree to start the conversation there. Now, as you work along the whole continuum of scenario creation right into informing decisions, the scenario stories themselves begin to recede into the background because the conversation grows and builds from there. But it's a very powerful tool for just getting the conversation going. And the other thing that is generated through a scenario creation exercise is a very good list of key issues. And this list of key issues will, without doubt, be a much broader list of issues than if any single organization or any single person just sat down and made a list. The process itself is powerful in that it facilitates an ordered dialogue about complex and often sensitive topics. And sometimes it's worth just doing a scenario creation exercise if you just have a really highly polarized topic that you haven't been able to get people to sit down and have a civilized conversation around. The process forces people to kind of put their positions aside. You bring them into the room and you say, I don't really care what your position on this issue is, That's not your job here today. Your job here today is to develop these stories about the future. And it's very interesting. People roll up their sleeves and they start to work collaboratively, and they do that. And through the process of doing that, they're having the conversation that's required. And this is extremely valuable process. Sometimes just to move things along. It also promotes integrative thinking. The process of developing the stories forces people to do integrative thinking and to explore the issue in ways and from perspectives that they have not personally done so in the past. And at the end of the scenario creation exercise, you have what I describe as cohesion. You don't have consensus around the issue, but you have a certain, what do I call it, respect for the issue that has been built by doing this work. And because you have respect for that issue, you can often get consent to move forward in the process. An example that I would give of that is some work that I did with the federal government in 2009, where we looked at what would climate change demand of the Canadian agriculture system in the future. And we had 135 people participated in that particular exercise that was led by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And we started out with a number of people in the room who even denied that climate change was going to happen. But as they went through the process, and this involved a series of workshops, starting out with a large scenario creation exercise and then some more interpretive exercise later, you could see that their thinking changed. At the end of the process, they didn't agree that climate change was a fact, but they did agree that climate variability was very serious and that maybe the government should spend some more time looking at this. Whereas at the beginning of the process, they basically said, I don't know what we're doing here, this is a waste of time. So that in itself, just that change of mindset, was a very valuable process in terms of being able to move forward and address some of the issues related to climate change in the agriculture sector. But I want to say that it's important to understand that more work, that scenario creation in itself is not the end. At the end of the scenario creation exercise, you have 4 stories, and you've got a lot of really exciting ideas. People are usually pretty hyped up about this kind of creative thinking. But a lot more work is required to interpret the stories and what has been learned, and to translate that material into a form that's useful to a policymaker or to any other key decision maker if you're doing this outside of a public sector environment. And this has got a number of challenges to it. And it's important when you start to conceptualize what your scenario creation exercise would be that you understand what these challenges are and tailor the approach in a way that will give you a better chance of successfully influencing key decision makers. So I'm going to go forward from here and talk a bit about the policy challenges that are presented by these large, generatively complex issues. I'll start by just looking at the 3 key elements of policy, just a little Policy 101 review. Policy is developed. First, there's the articulation of a problem. And this comes to the elected official, and he decides this is a big enough problem that something needs to be done about it. But when you have these large, generatively complex issues, it's really difficult to even decide what the problem is. I mean, if you're in the refrigeration business, you might think that global warming is the best business opportunity that's emerged in the last 50 years. On the other hand, if you live in the north and the ground is, the permafrost is melting underneath you, I mean, your view of global warming is completely different. So, the definition of the problem here is very difficult, and these are really knotty and tangled problems. You know, you have to get that definition going, and then you have to set policy goals. So what are you going to do about this problem? And of course, the setting of policy goals is very complex. We can see this through the Kyoto Protocol process, which has just come to an end, but it's gone on for a number of years. Where, you know, setting goals, you know, this has been a multi-year conversation, and some people would argue that it's a conversation that has a lot of discussion left to have. And then, of course, once you set the goals, you've got to choose the policy instruments whereby you achieve those goals. So are you going to tax people? You know, what kind of laws are you going to write? Educational programs. You might even choose to do nothing. But you know, this is where the devil's in the details, because you put a carbon tax in. Some people think that's a really good idea, and some people think that that's a really poor idea. You would think that the choice of policy instruments would be pretty much unlimited, but in fact, you know, the policymakers can only implement policy instruments that are, you know, publicly acceptable, that are legal, that are practical, that are in their jurisdictional right to do. You know, this is a pretty complex thing too. And then, you know, of course, all of these things have to work together. Like, there has to be alignment. So this is tough enough in a simple problem. You get a very complex problem, and the challenges are quite overwhelming. And, you know, if you're a public policy maker, that means you're an elected official. I mean, in the democratic process, the actual policy makers are the elected officials. The bureaucracy and the lobby groups and you know, the private sector players, they have all sorts of information and expertise. They may actually write up the policy, but in the end, it is executed by an elected official. Elected officials can only work within the social license handed to them by their constituents. And this cartoon is just meant to demonstrate that constituents can be in many different places in their thinking on some of these large, complex issues. Policy choices are defined by politics, and politics are all about interrelationships. They're characterized by conflict, influence, and power. They're you know, who benefits, where and when, you know, are key considerations. And the elected officials are influenced by powerful incentives to deliver benefits to their constituents quickly and to delay the imposition of costs. And the 4-year electoral cycle in itself is a pretty powerful incentive. So to take a long-term view on something, you know, is really quite a challenge. So the democratic process is challenged by long-term issues, such as climate change. And, you know, to put it in a nutshell, the choice to impose costs now to gain unspecified benefits to an undefined group of people in an unpredictable future time frame is often not acceptable to voters. Call this policy investment dilemma. And it really centers around asking your constituents to sacrifice now for the potential benefit to someone else in the future. So you have an issue like climate change, and you know what's going on, and you know it's gathering momentum, and you know that if you don't address it, it's going to get worse, and it's going to cost more. That's the, you know, that if you're taking the long-term view on it, you know, this is an issue that needs to be addressed. But you're working on a 4-year electoral cycle, and you're the prime minister, the premier, the president, whatever, you know, you are, but you're a leader. And so can you ask your constituents to sacrifice now, and can you invest significant costs so that you can accrue some rather fuzzy benefits in the future and lower those costs at some future point in time? And if you're an elected official on a 4-year electoral cycle, this is a dilemma for you. So policy instruments are, designed to change either people's behavior, the conditions within which they live and work and play, or to provide services. But whatever they are, they have to solve a problem and achieve a policy-specific goal. So elected officials, policymakers have really 2 or 3 modes of action. They can do nothing, and that's been a response that probably lingered on for a long time, and some people would probably still like to be doing nothing about climate change. And this can be a considered response. You can say either I don't have the resources to respond to this, it's not my jurisdiction, I've got other priorities, whatever it is. It doesn't mean that you just ignore it, but do nothing is a policy response. You can also act indirectly, say, fine, I'll put some grant money into the university and let them study it. Or maybe I'll give this to an NGO and they can, start to a public education program on energy efficiency, whatever. Or they can choose to roll up their sleeves and act directly, change procurement programs, write very direct legislation. These are the choices, right? But they're not easy because I use the example of smoking. How many years was it, after we knew that smoking was a human health issue? I would argue it was several decades before policymakers actually received the social permission to start to legislate smoking bans. And so, you get this, even though we may know we need to be acting on it, politicians can't go ahead without permission of their constituents. I'm just going to catch up with myself here. Pages. So it's fair to say that issues like climate change seriously strain the policymaking system. It's a classic example of diffuse benefits and concentrated costs. And those benefits are in the future and the costs are now. You get a lot of tension between individual and collective interests. So why should I not be able to drive any kind of vehicle I want as far as I want every year, just so that I can reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the end of my tailpipe, so that sometime in the future things are better. Very tough. Corporations say, why should I, take an economic hit to reduce my emissions, change my activities, when other people aren't going to do this? We get a large delay between the payment of the cost and the receipt of the benefits. We talked about that, so I won't go over that, but you get to a point where the constituents say, you know what, doing nothing is no longer an option. I'm worried about climate change, or I'm worried about smoking, or whatever else the issue might be. I want something done about it. I just don't want it to have to impact me. And that's kind of the situation that we're in right now. But from the position of the elected official or the policymaker, this is a very, very tricky point to be in. So what to do? How does someone who's tasked with putting together a strategy to address climate change go about it, given all of these constraints within the system? And the challenge really lies in uncertainty. I mean, if we can be certain about things going forward, it's much easier for us to act on them. If we look at climate change, we say, well, right now, we've been making climate-related observations now for several decades. We have made a number of inferences going forward related on those observations, and we started to gather some climate and greenhouse gas-related data, of which we can be pretty certain. We can verify it and feel pretty confident about that. we can speculate and maybe even begin to observe some geophysical impacts in various places in the global landscape. And, this leads to the conclusion that geophysical impacts of a certain nature are plausible and likely. So we can start to engineer around some of these things or, do what we can. Talking about biophysical impacts, now this is getting into a lot more complex and murky world. We have far less certainty, and this is really the issue where I think many of you are probably involved with, is looking at the biophysical impacts of climate change on the forest and how it's going to manifest itself at a landscape level, at a local level. There's a lot of uncertainty there. We don't know the degree, the pace. This is tough. Then you start to overlay the social and economic impacts of climate change. And this is, there's very little certainty here because some people will see economic opportunity, other people will be devastated by it. Some societies may flourish, others will be certainly damaged. To start to put into place policy strategies that will mitigate the social and economic impacts in the future, or the biophysical impacts of the future. This is getting to be far more complex. But we do know that the implications to humanity of climate change are profound. And so comes the necessity and the urgency to do something about it. So you can see the challenge, and this is where creation is a valuable tool because it helps key decision makers grapple with that future uncertainty. We recognize that uncertainty in the future can't be reduced, but it certainly can be studied. And through studying, you can change your perspective, broaden your thoughts, get some new insights, some new understandings, and that these can be used to inform the decisions that you're required to make today, and hopefully will result in the development of more robust and enduring policy strategies that will stand up under a range of different future scenarios. So this is where scenario creation is most valuable, is to do this. When we look at this whole business of trying to act in the face of uncertainty in terms of our response to climate change to date. I mean, it's taken a few years, but there's now a fair amount of consensus that climate is changing. We've inferred the impacts of it. They'll be ecological, social, and economic, and governments have began to try to develop responses. And the main response to date has been in mitigation, trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see, based on the discussion that I've just had with you, that there was a certain amount of data that was available, gives decision makers confidence. We could, track the trend of greenhouse gas emissions, and we start to get that hockey stick graph. It's measurable, it's verifiable. There's a defined set of variables, large final emitters, a certain set of gases. We can work with these things, and as a result, we've been able to get the beginnings of some policies and programs and education that will mitigate the amount of greenhouse gas that's emitted into the environment. But for those of you working on adaptation, you're in a much more challenging scenario. I mean, this is a much more emergent kind of issue. Really a lot of unknown and unverifiable impacts that we can infer. Our ability to provide verifiable and measurable data about those is not possible because they are unfolding as we study this. We know that the chains of cause and effect are far apart, and this is, really, really subject to diverse and complex social perspectives and challenges. So when you start talking about how are you going to adapt to changing climatic or climate-driven change, this is really, really fraught with uncertainty. So, you need a tool like scenario creation to help you start to think about this, draw some conclusions. You'll never reduce the future uncertainty, but you can move forward with a bit more confidence if you can undertake an exercise like this. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the focal question, because, and this is where I'll bring this to a conclusion. If you're going to undertake a scenario creation exercise, it's imperative that you ask the right question. And I have been involved in scenario creation exercises where people have worked very hard for 2 or 3 days, sometimes more, but they've been working on the wrong question. And after all that time, they've generated some really good insights and understandings, but it's not about the issue that they needed to be addressing. People often really underestimate the amount of effort and time that it takes to develop the right kind of focal question. And focal questions have some characteristics that need to be kept in mind. I mean, first off, the question itself has to be an open-ended question. It can't have a right answer. If the answer is yes or no, or black or white, or whatever, then either the issue is not an issue that you should be using scenario creation to address, or you simply have brought your own biases forward as you form that focal question. Because it's really important that you develop a focal question to try to avoid value statements and biases being embedded in the question. And by that I mean words like better or improve or anything that's open to subjective judgment. The question has to be written in a way that invites exploration and that it doesn't impose boundaries by leaving certain things in or out of the conversation. And the ideal focal question is it can deliver a bit of a emotive response when people read it. I mean, that's really good, right? It kind of gets people fired up. So I've posed 2 questions. The first one is, what will climate change demand of the Canadian forest sector by 2050? And I think that this is a pretty good focal question because it doesn't leave anybody out. We're talking about the forest sector, and collectively as a group of participants, you can decide who that is. But to me, that's everybody that's involved in the forest in Canada. So that's public, private, the research community, the NGOs. Are all elements of the forest sector. Now, I've chosen the year 2050 for this question, but that's arbitrary, and as a group you can decide on that. But it seems to me that in the life of a forest and the landscape, 40 years is a reasonable amount of time to be thinking ahead. You could go further, you could go shorter, but that's good. By asking the question, what will climate change demand? It really broadens out the opportunity to explore the interaction of the forest and climate change to the maximum. And it doesn't have any value statements written into it. How do I get something better, or how do I, So I think this is a pretty well-formed focal question and would serve a scenario creation exercise quite well. Compare that to the second question I've posed here. By 2050, what will be required to sustainably manage the Canadian boreal forest? Now this question, some people may say that they're quite similar, but on deep examination they're not. what will be required to sustainably manage? So sustainably manage is almost a value judgment. You get into an argument about what does it mean to be a sustainably managed forest, and of course, obviously, different people will have different views on that. So, I mean, that in its own way becomes tricky. And then by just saying the Canadian boreal forest, I mean, who's included in this conversation? I mean, if you were an NGO, you know, what would your role would be? And who's going to be the manager? Is it going to be the private sector or the public sector? Or, so you can see that this question is not as succinct, as open, as free as the first question. Really spending time on the focal question is just so critical, and sometimes when we're doing scenario creation exercises, we actually spend hours spread over several days. So sometimes it could be like a 10-day conversation, an hour a day kind of thing, as people think about this and debate it and roll it around in their mind. So my point here is, if you're going to invest a significant amount of time and money that it takes to do a scenario creation exercise, make sure you've invested the time up front to make sure that the question you're asking is the one that you need the answer to. And you know, can't give you a better piece of advice about it as you go forward. So I think we're coming up to pretty much the end of our time here. So I'm just going to conclude here by saying that I think scenario creation is a valuable research approach, that it will generate new insights and understandings about the future if you care to undertake the work. But before you enter into the work, spend the time to consider the question and also undertake the work with the end user in mind and what challenges that policymaker is faced with. So, and realize that the scenario creation exercise itself is just step one, that you're going to have to spend more time after development of the stories interpreting them and communicating them in a way that's policy appropriate. What I have observed in the past is that people will do the scenario work, do a pretty good job of writing up the stories, and then that becomes the report, and they hand that off to the decision maker, and he looks at these stories, and you know, they go on the shelf. This is not useful information to the person who has to make decisions. So there's a whole bunch more work that has to happen in between the development of the stories before they end up on the desk as a set of recommendations or whatever to a decision maker. It is a significant investment of time and money to undertake this work, but I think it's well worth it if it's done well. And I've included my contact information here for you, and I invite you, if you are interested in asking me more questions or picking my brain on this in any way in the future, feel free to get a hold of me. And I'm going to conclude now, and thank you very much, and we can take some questions if anybody has questions right now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lois. Great presentation. So yes, let's jump right into any questions that the participants might have. So just a reminder that you can use the chat box if you would like to do that, or just hit *6 on your telephone. So is there anybody that would like to start us off on the conference call line?
And then how should I respond to those people that have, should I read out a chat box question that's come in, or everybody can see it and I can answer it?
Sure, everyone can see it. I can read it out loud for everyone here. So
I see Don McDonald has posted one. So
yes, he writes, do you ever do ex-post work on some of your earlier foresights to see how they performed? For example, your 2006 forest sector work. The lumber industry now seems to be booming again due to high demand for wood from the US and Asia. Much of this demand seems to be from climate disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. Was today's ex-post reality actually foreseen in any fashion in your 2006 work, or was this a black swan event? Yes.
Okay. Hi, Dawn. Yes, we do. That work, the forest sector work, actually is getting old enough now that we can begin to see some of the threads and some of the stories manifesting themselves in the current situation. Remember, we did that work looking at a 20-year horizon, so the stories themselves were set 20 years from now, and we're, 8-9 years, 6-7 years out from when we developed the stories. The one story that we did, really see kind of coming to fruition was the one I mentioned where, we forecast a lot of surplus wood and low stumpage wood that's going to become available through surge cuts in response to mountain pine beetle. And that we went through a period of time where the U.S. Demand for this wood just wasn't there. Now we are seeing some resurgence, and this is typical Hurricane Sandy and a few odds and ends that, this is, these things we can pretty much predict they're going to happen because, as I said about tornadoes, we do know that hurricanes happen, and these kinds of events always create a certain demand for lumber. At the time that we did this work, we did discuss, we did discuss the state of the economy, and you will remember that 2006 was a couple or 3 years before the economic crash. And I would say that the state of the economy, as we discussed it at that time, is still not clear. I mean, there is a certain, a little spike that's happening in the forest industry right now, and I think lumber prices are higher than they have been for several years. But whether this, in fact, is sustainable over the long haul is something quite different. So yes, one of the things that happens when you do scenario work and you've been involved with it is that you start to interpret signals that you see. You read something in the paper and you go, oh, we talked about that in our scenario climate to profit. Like, this is an early signal that we could be on the path to that particular scenario. So the interpretation work just continues on. None of those stories are predictions, so none of them will ever, come out to the letter that that's the future. But what you do see is certain characteristics or components that made each story unique, and you can start to say that, I think we're actually moving into this quadrant, this story in this quadrant. Okay, Brian Eddy has written, the question is, early in your presentation you made a number of comments regarding the qualitative aspects of scenarios, and that is good to use, and that it is good to use science where possible. Can you clarify what you mean here? Does this imply that using science is optional? What message might this send to people concerned about the relationship between science and policy? Just so you know, I'm of the opinion that all scenarios and data used in them must be science-based. So Brian, there is no data about the future. There is data, the nature of data is that it's a numerical assessment of something that has happened, and you've been able to measure it, hopefully verify it, whatever. We can take that data and we can try to project it forward, but we can only do that with a limited amount of confidence. So to say that, I'm going to use an example of demographic data. You would think that demographic data would be data that we could project forward for a period of time with a certain amount of confidence, perhaps more than other data that we can project forward, because we know how many people are alive in the world today. We know the birth rates. We know the mortality rates. We know how long people live. So you think that we could put forward a set of population data projected forward 20 years with fairly high degree of confidence. And perhaps we can do it with a reasonable degree of confidence, but we can't do it with absolute confidence because there are issues like wars and pandemics and starvation and all these other things that influence the number of people alive, and then you have changes in birth control technologies and politics. China's talking possibly about backing off on their one-child policy. Iran just took away all public support for contraception from its female population. All of these things, so you can see that we can only project that data forward with, well, the farther out we get, the less reliable it becomes. We get into these uncertainties. So we do know that, the sun comes up in the east and sets in the west and that sort of thing. I mean, we're not going to refute the laws of nature in our stories about the future, and we're going to use science where possible, but the stories of the future can only be science-based to a limited degree, and that has to be accepted. And so what I see is, people developing computer models, which usually use data from the past or the present, certain mathematical formula, certain assumptions from the past and the present, and they project, they import this into the model and project forward to look at the future in a very static way. And often we're making some pretty key decisions based on those models, and really, they take very complex issues and simplify them. So I just say that we're all trained in Western society, to have this science-based proof, burden of proof. But as we deal with these emergent issues, we have to find different ways of making decisions, because we can't wait until we have the burden of proof to make decisions. It'll be too late. Let's see. Renee, do you have advice to give about managing different personalities involved in scenario writing? For example, could Delphi iterative step surveys help slow thinkers and fast speakers to exchange efficiently towards cohesion, if not consensus? Well, I have advice to give you about the different kinds of personalities that you need in scenario creation. Now, if by scenario writing you mean that development of scenarios, in terms of the scenario writing, the Delphi surveys are different than scenario creation. I mean, scenario creation never comes to consensus. That's why you create a set of stories. You don't just create a single story, because a single story would be a consensus-driven exercise where you got all those people with all that various expertise and perspectives and experience to agree that this is a single future. That becomes a prediction. And you don't want to do that because you can't predict the future. So you create this range of futures, and if you're involved in a Delphi survey, you send out a series of questions, and basically you're moving to consensus all the time, because the outlying ideas are, people have an opportunity to change their mind because they're told that they're not falling into the core, range of opinion or perspective, so they can, if they want to change their mind, they can, but otherwise, basically, those outlying ideas, which are often some of the most innovative, creative, exploratory ideas, are lost. So no, I would say I wouldn't want to use Delphi surveys to help me develop my scenario. And in terms of the mix of people that need to be involved in scenario creation, I would say you need a very eclectic group, and it's almost a half-a-day discussion about how you select those people. There are certain characteristics, and we can talk about that offline if you care to. Brian Eddy, yes, I agree, but forecasting prediction scenarios with uncertainties is a big part of science. My view is that science is not always about certainty, but about the process by which we work with verifiable and reproducible information. And I would agree that that is what science is about, that we work with verifiable and reproducible information. But not all science is about that, and in fact, a lot of quantitative scientific approaches, all you can do is look for trends and patterns, and in fact, you can't verify or reproduce, especially in the humanities, case studies, that sort of thing. You can only look for reoccurring themes and patterns. And in some ways, if you're thinking about the future, you can't, by the time we have the certainty that most decision makers would like about how climate change is going to impact the forest is already going to be impacted. We would have sacrificed the time frame where we could have made proactive decisions that possibly would have positioned us better. So it is scenario creation does go against the grain of those of us who are scientifically trained.
Okay. Thanks so much, Lois. I don't want to cut the questions short since it's such a good discussion, but I don't want to keep everyone too much longer since we've gone past 12 o'clock. So if anybody has any other questions, can they contact you via email or telephone?
Sure,
My name is Anne from Quebec. I just have a last question. In order to help the decision-making process, do you have at some point to study the probability that one of you, that your scenarios might happen or not?
No. We never ever put probabilities around the scenarios. Basically, what you have to do as you think about these is treat each as equally probable. Now, sometimes, as I said, the scenarios over time in discussion kind of tend to recede into the background, right? And at some point, somebody has to make some decisions, and it's wonderful if you can come up with a strategy that will help you under every scenario. As I mentioned about the forest management one, it was pretty clear when we got that exercise done that, the current forest management strategies that were in place weren't effective under any of the scenarios. That was a pretty clear learning. But the development of a strategy that would be effective under every one of those strategies is challenging, right? So, obviously no one usually wants to move towards the worst scenario. So your strategy is to stay out of the worst scenario, and you want to move to one of the more favorable scenarios. So you kind of pick the direction as opposed to the future. On the forest management, one side of the graph was you maintain biophysical capacity. I don't think anybody wants to work in a future where they're losing biophysical capacity. So, you looked at what the implications of that side were. You kind of move. It's really not which is more likely to happen or the other. Really it's what do you want to avoid and where do you want to go to. That said, often people in the exercise will say, I think we're in this story. They'll say, I think right now we're sitting in this story, right? Almost every exercise people do that. And, that sort of in a way puts a probability around that story that people think it's already happening. But thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for the questions. And like it says in the chat box there, it would be great if you can continue this discussion on the FACoP forum page where you can ask questions, and then maybe, Lois, I know you're part of the FACoP now, so maybe if people have questions, they can post them there and you can give them a reply.
Sure.
Okay, great. So I hate to cut it short, but thanks everyone for joining the FACoP webinar today. We hope you enjoyed it. And obviously a very big thank you goes out to you, Lois, for your time and effort for a great presentation and discussion. So any last comments from you before we wrap things up here?
No, I'd just like to say that this has been a lot of stuff compressed into, into an hour. I mean, this is days and days of ours, to break it all apart and sort of put you through a training course. There's days could be spent on each one of these slides, so, it is a lot of compression here. But hopefully it gave you a few things to think about as you consider this tool.
Perfect. Okay, thanks so much. And then thanks again, everyone, and have a great week.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.